Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where international affairs are discussed. I'm Martin Zubko. Today I'm interested in Fukushima, a disaster which happened in 2011. Nowadays we have a discussion about the radioactive water being released or supposed to be released in upcoming days in Japan. So I'm joined with Maxime Polleri from Canada. Hello, Maxime.
Hello, Martin. Thank you for having me here.
Maxime Polleri is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at Université Laval in Canada, Quebec. As an anthropologist of science and technology, he studies the governance of disasters and public health crises. His current research projects focus on the 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster, the COVID-19 pandemic, and global epidemic alerting systems. Dr. Polleri is a network affiliate at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University, where he was previously a MacArthur Nuclear Security Pre- and Post-Doctoral Fellow. He is also a member of EPI AI Project, a Canadian-UK artificial intelligence grant initiative that studies digital disease surveillance, as well as a member of Mitate Lab, an international research program on Fukushima issues. We are interested in international relations, so can you please elaborate on diplomatic tensions that arose between Japan and other countries as a result of nuclear disaster? What can we observe or what can we know about this phenomenon?
Yes, of course. So, obviously, a nuclear disaster always creates a lot of diplomatic tensions. And, initially there was a lot of negative tensions with Japan's neighbors. So, perhaps most famously, Korea and China. And, these tensions really rose around radioactive contamination. The first one was food safety, for instance. So after the disaster, basically you had South Korea that banned some imports of Japanese food, and the import roughly fell by 75% in 2011, which is obviously a huge number. So food safety created a lot of tension between these countries because not everybody has necessarily the same inspection procedures. They don't necessarily have the same standards in regard to radiation safety. And beyond food safety, another point of tension was the 2020 Olympics. For instance, there was a lot of concern about radiation that came back when Japan was chosen to host the 2020 Olympics, which were eventually delayed because of the COVID-19. But you had, for instance, politicians, civil groups that wanted to boycott the Olympic because of safety concern over radiation. There were athletes, for instance, that talk about food safety, and there were talks about providing Korean-made food during the Olympics. And well, most recently, something that we've been hearing a lot in the news is the announced to release the wastewater in the Pacific Oceans. So right now, we've got Korea that is very worried about the impacts of the release of radioactive wastewater because, they're very close to the Japanese archipelago. There's the agriculture minister, for instance, that says that the import ban on Fukushima food will remain in place. Beyond Korea, you also have China that has been highly critical of this plan to release wastewater in the Pacific. You've got Foreign Ministry spokesperson who claimed that the Pacific Ocean is not a sewer for Japan to offload contaminated water. So I think that this wastewater issue will really cause a lot of further diplomatic tensions in regard to global seafood exports. And basically, when we look at the history of these countries' relationship, these kinds of tensions are not really surprising. Some people might know Korea used to be a colony of the Empire of Japan. China faces a share of war atrocity from Japan during the first half of the 20th century. So basically, those are historical scares that are still highly present and that are going to merge with nuclear-related tensions. So we can see that you have very specific aspects of a nuclear disaster that can be strategically mobilized, often for geopolitical reasons. But beyond that, also, it's important to say that the diplomatic tensions have shifted a lot since 2011, and that this shift have also depend on who was on power. So, for instance, in the beginning of the disaster, Japan was ruled by Naoto Kan and also by Yoshihiko Noda, who both belonged to the Democratic Party of Japan. And basically, the Democratic Party of Japan is a centrist political party. Naoto Kan was known to be able to gain support from the Chinese and the South Korean leaders. And both of these leaders have shown a lot of support for the disaster at the beginning. They were the first foreign minister to actually come to Fukushima. And there was a picture of the three of them, eating cucumbers to show that the food is safe in Fukushima. So we see that diplomatic tensions are far from being either white or black. There's a lot of contradiction. On one point, you can have a food ban, and on the other point, you have prime minister sharing pictures together. The negative tension were worse when the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe came in power in 2012. So Shinzo Abe was from the Liberal Democratic Party, which is a much more conservative party. It also has a history of tense diplomatic tension with China and with South Korea. And it really did not help that Shinzo Abe visited the Yasukuni Shrine during his prime ministership. So for those that don't know what the Yasukuni Shrine is, it's basically a shrine in Japan that honors the war dead. And it's a very controversial place because basically you have war criminals that are buried there. And every time some sort of Japanese elite go and visit this place, it usually angers South Korea and China because it's seen as a symbol of Japan's past military aggression. So that's a visit that really did not help to ease the tension that the nuclear disaster had brought. But you also had a lot of productive ties, of productivity that came from this disaster. So the nuclear catastrophe also allowed Japan, for instance, to strengthen its ties with its ally, most notably the United States. Some might remember the Operation Tomodachi, which mean a friendship in Japanese, which was a disaster relief operation by the U.S. Armed Force. So that's an operation that basically strengthened the link between Japan and the U.S., and especially in a context where there's a lot of Japanese citizens that have historically criticized the presence of the U.S. Armed Force in Okinawa, so an island that is situated south of Japan, where there's a lot of United States Army base. Also, if we think in terms of decommission, for instance, well, the decommission of the crippled power plants is going to take decades and decades to do. So this is something that's going to require the presence of international experts and of organizations like the International Atomic Energy Agency. So I'm pretty sure that this is going to promote diplomatic relationship between Japan and these broader agencies, which are usually closely tied with liberal democracy in the world. So that's about what I have for the first question.
Was there any protest or reaction of people who are Koreans living in Japan? Like internally, I mean, or for instance, Chinese community in Japan, maybe some international community in Japan?
I haven't seen a lot of anger or frustration from internal community. For instance, if we talk about Korean living in Japan, well, a lot are, for instance, Zainichi Korean, which their parents came in Japan and they've been raised often in a Japanese environment. Most of the time, they don't even have their Korean surname. They've adopted Japanese name, Some don't even speak Japanese. And, immigration, as opposed to the United States, for instance, it's not a very powerful force in the internal politics of Japan. The number is just not high enough to really warrant some sort of political resistance that you could have in other much more perhaps multi-ethnic country. That's not to say that Japan is perfectly homogeneous. I mean, there's a lot of stereotypes surrounding this homogeneity, which is not true. I mean, there's homogeneity within Japan with the Ainu in Hokkaido, with the Okinawan. There's lots of Chinese immigrants, Finnish immigrants, and so on. But in terms of their political weight, it's perhaps not the same that you will have in other countries. So from my experience, I might be wrong about that, but I've not seen a lot of very specific political movement coming from Korean or Chinese minority in Japan.
Okay. How did the Fukushima disaster influence international policies on nuclear energy? I mean, globally, not only in Japan.
So basically, before Fukushima, Japan really had one of the most well-respected nuclear and radiological scientific communities in the world. They were really part of a nuclear power industry revival that was known as the nuclear renaissance. So, before Fukushima, other nuclear disasters like 3 Mile Island or Chernobyl were, slowly being put in the past. Chernobyl, for instance, was starting to be globally depicted as an exceptional disaster, which was the result of poor science or communist ideology by the Soviet Union. So around the early 2000, 2010, we're really on the verge of what some people have called a nuclear renaissance. You had a lot of different countries that wanted to develop more nuclear power. Japan also had this ambition. Before the disaster, the part of nuclear energy in Japan, electricity was about 30%. And basically, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry really wanted to up that to close to 50%. So the disaster in general really put a halt to this nuclear renaissance, not just in Japan, but also globally. One of the most famous influence, for instance, might be Germany. It's a disaster that, partly influenced Germany's decision to phase out from nuclear power. And there are other countries that are usually very much pro-nuclear, like France or the United States, begin to reinforce their own nuclear safety by trying to learn from this disaster. So globally, it's a disaster that really impaired the dream for those that wishes to see further nuclear power in the world. Japan was at the top of the food chain in regard to nuclear science. It was a disaster that was never supposed to happen, according to members of the nuclear industry. After the disaster, there's some people that have tried again to say that this was an exceptional case, citing, for instance, the unique geography of Japan, a landscape that's prone to earthquake and tsunami. There's a lot of people who thought that, perhaps like Germany, Japan will phase out from nuclear power. After all, there's a rich history of anti-nuclear activism in Japan, but, as time has shown us, Japan has not forgone nuclear power. And I think there's, basically 4 reasons for why non-nuclear Japan is not going to happen. So one of the first reasons regarding this is energy independence. So historically speaking, Japan has always deployed vast resources to make nuclear energy a national priority, especially for a country that was lacking natural resource. So for the Japanese elite, nuclear power was much more than electricity. It was always a symbol of energy independence for Japan. Even nowadays, if we think about trade disputes, if we think about the long-term tense relations with the neighbors of Japan, there's a lot of experts who believe that Japan needs to decrease its dependence on external energy suppliers. So lots of people claim that nuclear power should be fully restarted as they believe that it provides a stable and Japanese-made energy supply. The second reason for why Japan might not abandon nuclear power is the tropes of clean energy. So before the disaster, nuclear power was depicted as the clean energy of the future. There was even a sign that literally said this in Fukushima. But the release of radioactive pollutant after the disaster has completely tarnished the trope of nuclear power as a source of clean energy. But even nowadays, proponents of nuclear power are resorting to a similar rhetoric, which is based on the specter of global warming. So, for instance, following the moratorium of nuclear power after 2011, you have Japanese elite, you have scholars who argue that the emission of carbon dioxide have increased because of Japan's reliance on fossil fuels. So in this kind of context, global warming is more and more being mobilized or depicted as a threat that nuclear power can ward off. The third reason for why Japan is not going to abandon nuclear power is linked with technical expertise. So again, Japan was really a pioneer in terms of technological expertise around nuclear power. And that echoed a kind of pre-war model of Japanese spirits and Western technique, that has often come throughout Japan's modernity. So, for instance, the young post-war Japanese, they duty follow the adventure of Astro Boy, this little android that was powered by a nuclear heart. Even the Japanese name of Astro Boy, which is Tetsuan atom, literally means, strong atom, the powerful atom. And it perfectly, for me, encapsulate this imaginary of this era, where nuclear power was associated also globally with domains of technological wonder, of amazement, rather than with the vast emotional scars of atomic bombings. So Fukushima was a really harsh blow on this expertise, and it caused the nuclear community to adopt a very pessimistic vision about the future of nuclear research. So when I was in Japan and when I spoke with scientists in the nuclear domain, most of them really shared a fear that they wouldn't be able to recruit, future students to come work in nuclear-related research after this disaster. So for some people, this absence of Japan's technical prowess in the nuclear domain is associated with a lot of negative consequence for international technological competition and innovation. So it's a kind of technological expertise that is still widely cherished by politicians. And the last reason for why Japan might not necessarily abandon nuclear power is in regard to international security. So we've already talked about how this disaster created a lot of tensions in regard to international security. And nowadays, it's a well-known fact that Japan has the capacity to nuclearize itself. The Porphyrian sheet to create a nuclear arsenal was even supported in 1994 when the then Prime Minister Hatatsutomu said, it's certainly the case that Japan has the capability to possess nuclear weapons, but has not made them. So while Fukushima was really a catastrophic event for Japan, it did not necessarily ease the tense relationship that the archipelago had with its neighboring countries. We can think about the rise of militaristic China, the Senkaku Island disputes, the firing of North Korean missiles over the Sea of Japan, and so on. So those are all events that really influence Japan's national defense policy. So in this kind of context, if you have a non-nuclear Japan, well, it risks destabilizing the global strategic nuclear balance and the overall geopolitics of East Asia. And, with many neighbors becoming more and more influential, you have Japanese elites and you have proponents of the liberal international orders who probably want to conserve Japan's technical ability in the nuclear domain. So this ability to create a nuclear bomb, if the need ever arose, can still act as a form of deterrence to ease those geopolitical tension. And a non-nuclear Japan is something that will change the international geopolitics of East Asia. And there's a lot of factors that don't want to see this happening. Obviously, the United States.
Right. I'm very happy that you opened so many interesting questions by your answers, especially with the geopolitical security connections, which I think gives tremendous opportunity for research and for really curious questions. One of the questions I was asked in Scotland was when Japan had that sort of nuclear break in Japan from 2011 till, let's say 2022, how was the development, the research and development in nuclear sphere? Was this also like stopped or this sphere continued despite, bad atmosphere and all those thoughts that, we are on the top of the nuclear science and we had a disaster just on our territory. So because students are interested in, what's happening behind the doors, as we say.
So yeah, of course, this research was not, completely stopped. The infrastructure, the teaching infrastructure, the structural infrastructure was just way too big for everything to close suddenly. What there was, however, was a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of anxiety. So, for instance, before the disaster, Japan, like other countries in the world, has a lot of problem with high-level nuclear waste. So, waste that comes from its power plant, like other countries, they don't necessarily know what to do with it. And internationally, the thing to take care of such waste is to create what they call a deep geological repository. So basically, burying this waste in the ground. And this wasn't, for instance, a plan that was really pushed a lot before the disaster. You had an organization called NUMO that was supposed to take care of that. Obviously, the disaster kind of slowed this a little bit, but it still doesn't take care of the problem of the waste, which is, still sitting near the nuclear power plants. So nothing was necessarily stopped per se. It was perhaps slow a little bit, but it wasn't a full stop. And it's also important to say that at the same time, this is a disaster that was both a curse and a blessing for the nuclear industry, because the decommission of the nuclear power plant, the decontamination of Fukushima were really, high-scale enterprise that required a lot of international cooperation, that required top-notch science, top-notch expertise. So in a way, some of the actors that are partly responsible for the disaster are also going to make a lot of money in these decommission projects and these decontamination projects. So simply for the decommission of the nuclear power plant, I think it's impossible to envisage a non-nuclear Japan. They have some of the expertise to do so. They have the collaboration of the liberal world order. So I really don't see this as a stop for the nuclear industry in Japan. On the contrary, I think they'll be able to use this disaster for their own interests. And then we go back at the old question of who actually gets served by disaster relief and disaster management, which is a much more touchy question that sometimes angers a lot of local citizens.
And just for the interest, when there is a new nuclear plant, proposed in Europe or somewhere in the world, usually we have like Russians, like Rosatom is coming, South Koreans are coming that want to build, Americans are coming, they want to build it. In terms of that sort of like complete nuclear technology, is Japan able to build a nuclear plant by or with only Japanese technology, or Japan was also collaborating with the world in this, like for instance, Siemens from Germany is supplying something, maybe some different companies from America, like GE, because we see this collaboration in Europe, like at the moment we see the General Electric, for instance, collaborating with Russians in Hungary, which is quite surprising, despite all the political tensions, because the nuclear plant is super complex project, it's not like to build some sort of easy project. So I'm just interested in, what sort of percentage can Japan put from internal knowledge and science?
Well, I think that this super complex aspects of nuclear power plant is very interesting because, on the one hand, you have these tropes of it's a Japanese-made energy. It helps to create Japanese independence. But as you said, there are infrastructure that are so complex that they require, whether or not you want it, international cooperation. For instance, uranium that comes from other part of the world, different parts of technologies that are made in America and so on, special lasers being created in Japan, for instance. So it is a real international endeavor, whether people want it or not. What I think will be much more harder for Japan to do is to propose the creation of new power plant on its land after Fukushima. Um, I can't see the population necessarily accepting this, even if politicians were to propose fully Japanese technology and so forth. I think that the damage has already been done, so that it might be impossible to propose new building of nuclear power plant, which will be very problematic because most of Japan's reactor are from older generation. They're already aging. Most of the time, their life expectancy has already outgo the normal life expectancy that they were supposed to go. So I can't really see new projects being implemented on Japanese soil.
Exactly, and I can say that I can completely agree, because when you have like a natural gas power plant, you stop the gas, you send the workers, and within 1 or 2 months you have a land and you can build whatever else you want. But I know from my research and experience that, for instance, when you want to decompose the nuclear plant, it takes just 15 or 20 years to cool down the rods, then water, then the reactor core. So I think, I don't know, I'm not the expert, but I think that's gonna be a tough question for Japan, because if you have the old reactor, it doesn't work that you just send like 20 workers and they will swap it for the new one. So I think this will open also some questions about how or what to do with the nuclear plants that that have been decommissioned, or that are basically too old to be in process of delivering the electricity. But also, let's speak, because you are the expert or also in anthropology, from the anthropological perspective, the society in Japan before and after Fukushima.
Yeah. Well, obviously as an anthropologist, cultural changes, what we eat regularly, it's, the thing that really interests us. And that's a disaster that has kind of really revitalized anthropological studies of Japan because, we at the beginning of this disaster wonder, what kind of change is going to happen, what kind of change has already happened. And I think, one of the biggest change that we saw in Japanese society was that it was a disaster that really tarnished the trust that citizens had toward their government. So basically, before Fukushima, you had a government that always said that a disaster was impossible. They always said, a disaster cannot happen underground. We have the best technology, we have the best engineer. We're not like the Soviet Union. It's impossible to have a disaster here. And after the disaster, they had a very specific word for that, which is a sotegai, which means beyond expectation. So because the myth of nuclear safety really crumbled, because of this myth of nuclear safety that was prevalent before Fukushima, We can say that the state was very much ill-prepared to manage the aftermath of a disaster. So he had, for instance, poor evacuation drill. There was a lot of problem with risk communication. There was debate and controversy surrounding evacuations. You had people that were put in charge of management that had no expertise on nuclear security per se. So one of the things that the disaster really did is that it broke the safety net around nuclear power, what the Japanese call Anzan Shinwa. People began to lose trust in their state experts. One of the very popular words that we heard after this disaster was Goyo Gakusha, which can be translated as a kind of lapdog scholar that is lacking independence. And one of the consequences of this is that we saw a rise in citizen science. So people, everyday people that have no expertise whatsoever about radiological safety, but that decided, for instance, to track radiation by themselves, to measure food for radioactive contamination and so on, because they did not trust their government. Another internal change that we saw was a change in the way through which nuclear power was regulated. So before the disaster, Japan used to be under two umbrellas. The nuclear safety was under two umbrellas. You had the Nuclear Safety Commission on one hand, which was under the authority of the Japanese cabinet, and you had the Nuclear Industrial Safety Agency, which was under the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry. But one of the problems with the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry was that it used to have a very ambivalent position, because it was both promoting nuclear power while serving as a safety regulator. So this was a clear case of regulatory capture. So it's a position that led to it's a position that basically led to a culture of collusion within nuclear safety in Japan. You had senior bureaucrats, for instance, in regulatory agency that were known to retire to the private sectors and the electric companies. It's a practice that is known as amakudari, and it's literally means descent from heaven. So to change this kind of culture of collusion that was really strong in nuclear safety, the government decided to get rid of the former nuclear safety regulator and to create a whole new agency in 2012 that was called the Nuclear Regulation Authority. It's a decision that can be applauded, but we'll have to see if this new agency is actually independent. There's a lot of scholars who have claimed that this new agency, the Nuclear Regulation Authority, is more a reorganization than a significant reform, because you have a lot of former employees from the two other regulatory agencies that have been moved to this new agency. So you basically have a bunch of the same people with perhaps the same culture that are now in this agency. So obviously, as an anthropologist, there was a lot of change at the micro level. People whose life was completely destroyed, people whose trust in the government is never going to come back. A lot of change at the local scale, lots of change when we look at the life of people, when we look at local government and things like this. But the change at the broader structural level are still not felt. I don't see them clearly. For instance, the anti-nuclear position has not succeeded after Fukushima. The liberal democratic power is still in power. It's one of the most powerful political party. There is not another party that has come. Japan did not abandon nuclear energy. So in many aspects, it still seems to me to be business as usual. And in regard to international relation, in regard to broader scholarship, I think this really force us to ask, do major shocks, like economic crisis, disaster, terrorist attacks, war, and so on, lead to radical and unprecedented change within society? So there was a huge debate surrounding this inquiry recently. You have scholars who point out that disaster are too often depicted as moments that supposedly mark transition between different epochs. And within my own work on Fukushima, I've tried to resist this theorizing of Fukushima as a fundamental game changer. And there's many reasons for embracing this view. I think that first, if we describe Fukushima as a kind of unprecedented event, we risk bringing a kind of assumption of equilibrium prior to disaster. But if we look at Japan before 2011, Japanese society was never in a perfect state of equilibrium. It was affected by an aging population, by economic torpor, by geopolitical tension, by social precarity. So if we focus on disaster as process rather than just as heaven, we can see this kind of pattern of social cultural continuity that emerge after a disaster. So I don't necessarily see disaster as creating a kind of tabula rasa that will create, unprecedented social cultural change. Again, there's a lot of local change that have happened after this disaster, but at the broader structural level, change is also in dialogue with prior social elements. And I think that this really affects the realm of possibilities for what we mean by cultural change.
Do you also see a bit of pressure from international community? For instance, some inspectors coming to Japan, to see what sort of regulations are in place, what's the stage of the current nuclear plants and what was the situation in this sphere? Because naturally, that's the question which, arises from what you said.
Yeah, totally. I mean, this obviously made me think about the position that the International Atomic Energy Agency has toward Japan. Um, Japan was really the poster child in regard to nuclear power after World War II. From a country that was from a military-driven country, a dictatorship basically, that was completely crushed after the end of World War II. They were able to become, the second economy in the world in a relatively short amount of time. And a lot of proponents of nuclear power have said that this was also because of their ability to harness nuclear energy. So I think there's a lot of international pressure to demonstrate that Japan will be able to recover as a nation, and not as any nation, as a nation of the liberal world order, to show that capitalists, to show that democracy is able to triumph even in the aftermath of the biggest nuclear disaster possible on the event scale of the IAEA. So obviously, I'm pretty sure that international agencies are facing a lot of pressure to enable Japan to get back on its feet. And from where I stand, I think that they have partly succeed so far. We do see a lot of discontent, for instance, regarding wastewater with South Korea, which is mocking IAEA, for instance, or with China. So I think this is going to put further pressure on these international organizations to help Japan get back on its feet.
I think that's a very positive news because from a research point of view, we know Japan is slightly closed country. When you want to research some documents or regulations, it's not as easy as, for instance, in Europe or United States or Canada. So I think that's a very positive news. Let's get to the water, the current topic. What are the implications of this act in terms of Pacific, of nature? That's the first question. And the second question coming from my students, why this water is going to be released? Is there any other way? Like for instance, one of the students said they can heat it up and and convert it to steam or something else, and just to store it somewhere.
Yeah, of course. So first of all, I'm not a marine biologist, so I can't talk about the science on the marine ecosystem. But that being said, there's a lot of scientific uncertainty surrounding tritium. There's been a lot of debates, regarding the danger of tritium, and one of the problems is that there's actually few studies that look at the health consequence of tritium for human beings. There's a book that has been recently released called Exploring Tritium Danger. So I think that this might be a better resource for your students than the viewpoint of an anthropologist on the scientific aspects of this. One of the difficulty with tritium in the wastewater is that basically tritium it's similar to a water molecule, so you can separate it. So if it goes in the air, tritium is also going to go in the air. And one of the important thing to say is that radioactive decontamination does not exist per se. There's no, if you want, a kind of magical powder that you can sprinkle that will get rid instantly of radioactive contamination. Radioactive waste, for instance, they can be buried in the ground. The radioactive wastewater, it can be diluted in the ocean. Or things that are contaminated can be reduced in size if you incinerate them. But none of these processes will actually stop the phenomenon of radioactivity. Waste that is buried is still radioactive. The radioactive pollutants that are in the ocean are going to disperse themselves. Incinerated waste is going to create radioactive ash, which also need to be managed. So the only thing that takes care of radioactivity is time. So the longer the timeline, the less radioactive certain element becomes. And this really depends on each radionuclide. So you have radionuclides that have very long lifespans, in millenniums, and you have other ones that are very short, basically last a few hours, a few days, and so on. But this temporal aspects of radioactive contamination, which often exceed human life, it does bring a lot of unique governance problem because there's no government of the moment that can manage or tackle the long wingspan of contamination. Symbolically also, I think that the decision to release wastewater in the ocean is going to be very harmful for Japan. So again, I can't really talk about the health implication, but in terms of symbolism, which is my expertise as an anthropologist, I think that is going to be very damageable for Japan. Because since 2011, they've been working very hard to change the image of Japan, from a country that faced a tremendous nuclear disaster into a country that was able to become resilient, was able to overcome this disaster. So releasing this wastewater, it really goes against a lot of the efforts that the government has made to take care of their own reputation. We're already seeing what it goes in the news. It's being condemned by different organizations. You've got videos of Korean people ordering salt, being concerned about seafood and so on. So from a cultural viewpoints, I think the implications are going to be very harsh in the following years, especially since there's tons and tons of wastewater. And this is not something that's going to be done in 1 day. It's going to take years, and even decades to release the water safely.
And do you know some details about procedure? For instance, is it known like how many liters will go to the ocean, let's say, per month?
Yeah, the Japanese government is going to give, much more specific details probably at the end of the summer, I think. But, as you said, if we look at the videos, if we look at the image, it's not merely one tank, it's dozen and dozen of gigantic tanks which hold tons and tons of wastewater. So if I'm not mistaken, I think that the release of radioactive water is going to be done on a time scale of 40 years. So we're talking about, other generations that are going to be affected by this problem. It's not something that's going to be done during one weekend and no problem done. It's going to take tremendous time to release this water.
And do we have any experience or any research that some country already released that water to the ocean, and what happened? Or is this going to be the first time that the humanity is going to proceed with such an act?
On this scale, it's really the first time. That being said, there's a rich history of nuclear waste being dumped at sea. You have a really great book about this called Poison in the Whale, which precisely look at this history of putting nuclear waste in the sea. And basically, even the scientists that were looking at the dispersion of radioactive contaminant in the sea claimed that monitoring in the sea was impossible. It was too big, it was too vast, it was impossible to really know where these kinds of radioactive pollutant will end up going. If you consider that there can be, for instance, bioaccumulation, so small sea life, being affected by this, being eaten by bigger fish, and so on. But what the scientists did say was that just doing the monitoring per se is a kind of performative act. It shows the world, it shows the population that you care, that at least you're trying to do something. But yeah, for those interested, I really recommend looking at the Poison in the Whale, which precisely look at this issue upon which I'm not an expert.
In terms of communication of the government, not only about the release of the water, how would you evaluate Japanese government in terms of communication with the public and the world?
So yeah, basically, we have the internal communication and also the external communication. So again, because of the safety net, Japan was really taken by surprise when the disaster happened. Managing both the internal and the international communication was really a huge problem. So in regard to internal risk communication, a lot of citizens were really angry at their inability to obtain rapid information. For instance, citizens couldn't obtain concrete information about the disaster in a timely manner. This was often because the tsunami and the earthquake had damaged the instrument of the Japanese state. So this created a lot of mistrust, a lot of anger toward the government. There was also a lot of confusion surrounding the evacuation orders and the radiation-related metrics. So basically, the evacuation order started as a small concentric circle, and then it gradually became bigger and bigger, which caused a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety for the population, which sometimes had to evacuate more than one time. Also, a lot of the information that was given to the public was done in a very hard to understand number. So, for instance, before the disaster, people had never heard about, what is a sievert, what's a microsievert, what's the difference between a myelin and microsieverts. These were all new terms that people had no idea what they meant. And you had different experts that used very different units, which made communication very hard for the public. A lot of people were also had to self-assess radiological risk. One of the problems that happened is that beyond the forced evacuation zone, the government also issued very specific response for residents that were within a certain radius. And basically, what they told them is that you need to assess the degree of risk, and then you can choose to evacuate on your own. So a lot of people, didn't understand why the government didn't give them a decision. Why did they have to make this decision by themselves when they don't know anything about radiation? One of the things that really angered people when I was there was a change of radiological safety standard. So one of the things that we often forgot about this disaster is that the safety standard has been changed by more than 20 times after the disaster. So basically, before 2011, the radiation threshold was 1 millisievert per year. And after the disaster, it was changed to 20 millisievert per year, so an increase by 20 times. And this was done because otherwise, too much people will have to be evacuated, and a lot of people will also die in the evacuation. But there's a lot of people that didn't necessarily understood the rationale behind this change. For them, they just saw a standard being suddenly changed like magic, and they wonder, why does radiation have suddenly become, less dangerous than before? And the government really fumbled in trying to explain the rationale behind this decision, which further created mistrust. There was also a lot of perceived adverse health effects from the disaster. So when I was in Japan, you had people that told me, for instance, that their children experience, nosebleed after disaster. There's also, the very controversial topic of thyroid cancer for children. And these kind of, perceived health threat. And again, I'm not a scientist, so I'm not saying that this is either true or false, but the population really perceived it as being linked with the disaster. And it was a sharp contrast with the government that, repeatedly claimed that there was going to be no health-related effects from the disaster. And another problem in international communication was contradicting international assessment. So, for instance, the United States advised a perimeter that was 80 kilometers for the evacuation of American citizens, as opposed to 20 kilometers for the Japanese government. So a lot of people with whom I spoke were, very angry. I mean, wondering, why are we supposed to evacuate within 20 kilometers, while the American can evacuate it on a much larger scale. Again, it's much more easier to evacuate the few Americans that were in this area than all Japanese. But this communication problem really created a lot of trust issue with the population. Yeah, go ahead.
From your expertise in international relations and anthropology, what do you think? How can the humanity better prepare for such disasters in the future? Is there any big lesson that we should apply or implement in those plans, disaster preparation, sort of simulations? How can you see the situation?
Yeah, I think that the current measures are wholly inefficient. These kinds of simulation, this kind of exercise, for me, I see them as let's keep with business as usual. I see them to keep the status quo in a way. And they are management practice that really don't tackle the broader structural problems that have brought the disaster, that have brought pollution in the first place. So what we need, to better prepare for the catastrophe, it's a total rethinking of our way of life. And that's not an easy thing to do. We need to rethink how and why do we produce energy. For instance, if we go back to Japan, nuclear was not picked because it was the most safe, the most efficient, or the cleanest form of energy. It was picked for a geopolitical reason of security. So we need much more sustainable values that are going to guide our choice, that are going to guide our society. Unfortunately, we are still thinking in terms of energy with short-term economic needs. I think we really need to get rid of those archaic values that were instilled in our energy grid. For instance, right now, the majority of nuclear power plants in the world have emerged from military designs. So things like safety, for instance, or proper waste management, these things were never important values that drove the designs of these infrastructure, that drove the governance of these energy system. So what we need is a fundamental rethinking of the values that drove our energy system. For instance, what happens if we start to think about energy problem with waste management first and foremost? So currently, our old infrastructure makes waste invisible. basically we can resume our old relationship with waste like this. So when my relationship with energy and waste is mostly as a customer. I press an interrupter and light happens. Where did the waste go? I don't know, and most people don't want to know. So I think we need very different values to guide where we should go as a world. And the thing that really interests me is that these are not questions that are going to be answered by technological fixes nor by engineers. They are questions that our students, political scientists, anthropologists, philosophers are going to answer, because at the core, these are social questions. They are not questions about, rate, energy, efficiency, and so on. They're really questions about the kind of values that are going to drive our world in the future.
Right. Yes, and also when we speak about energy, I think we should be more demanding and to ask questions like, is my energy coming from gas, wind, sustainable sources, because who is asking those questions? Usually people go to some comparison website and, this is cheaper, I will sign for 1 year or 3 years. But the concern is not there. Like I experienced this, for instance, in England when there was the conflict in Ukraine, and the UK was, thinking where to take the energy from because Russia was supplying natural gas to the UK, and people were looking not for the better answers, like better sources, but better price, because there was sort of like media chaos that energy will go up like 3 or 4 times. So people started to panic and they signed for 3 or 4 years with the cheapest possible company available on the market. So this is also like with the food. You can eat the lowest quality and you don't care, or you can eat healthy food because you care about yourself. So I think this should be also implemented in some way to the energy. The last question for today's interview, and this comes from my students. We have many radioactive sites in the world coming from the past, usually. For instance, Chernobyl, now we have Fukushima, we also have Mayak in Russia. And all these places, also some places in America where they try the nuclear weapons and bombs and everything. Is there any international consensus how to deal with those sites, or it's all under geopolitical constraints, that this is our thing, how we're going to do it? Just don't go here and don't send any inspectors because we are Russia, we are the USA, we are France, so we're going to deal with it. Because in terms of the international community and global affairs, that's a global problem. It's not a problem of one city or one country.
As you said, it's not a local problem. It's really everyone problem. And unfortunately, one of the big problem in terms of nuclear accident is that people too often think in terms of localized accidents. Even the name of disaster, it's very misleading because it reinforces localization of disaster. We think about Chernobyl, we think about Ukraine, but Chernobyl has contaminated a huge part of Europe. Even right now, Finland is still very much affected by this disaster. The meat of reindeer is still very radioactive. It needs to be tested every year. It's the same with Fukushima. I often met, Japanese citizens from other regions that were still, surprised that a foreigner wanted to study this disaster. They really thought that the disaster was over or that it was only in Fukushima. So in a way, there's no such thing as a local nuclear disaster. Every nuclear disaster is a global disaster. Radioactive pollutants, they travel, they circulate through the ecosystem, through the generation also. For instance, you talk about the tests being done in Nevada, in the southern part of the United States. Well, all these nuclear tests during the Cold War released tremendous amount of nuclear fallout. and which is present everywhere. You know, both you and I, we have strontium, radioactive strontium in our bones, in our teeth, from the release of radioactivity during these nuclear tests, even if we were born after those tests, because the lifespan of this pollution is so very long. So that's a concern that's really complicated by the temporal aspects of radioactivity. You know, like the lifespan of radioactive cesium, which is one of the most important pollutant after nuclear disaster, is 300 years. You know, that's a long time. In the meantime, you have new generation that are born. The border of countries might have drastically shifted. Uh, Government might not be the same. So contamination will keep getting reinterpreted in the future. And regarding this kind of global regulation, I'm really failing to see proper global concern in regard to nuclear disaster. I think, you know, as a society, we have been somehow successful at raising global concern for the threat of nuclear weapons. But there's still a lot of work being to be done in conceptualizing nuclear disaster as global disaster. And I think that's, unfortunately, that's one of the heritage of the dual use of nuclear energy, where bomb is seen as being bad and nuclear energy is seen as being good. And in real life, this is a dichotomy that's way too simplistic to ever work. So I think we really need to get rid of this kind of archaic mentality, this kind of archaic heritage, if we ever want to be able to have, you know, proper world regulation that are, you know, as much as independent as possible, or that can bring at least some sort of global awareness instead of saying, well, this is a Japanese problem, this is an Ukrainian problem.
Maxime, thank you very much for your insightful thoughts, your time and enthusiasm to explain this very difficult topic to our students and audience. And I think we have to think about it, especially nowadays, when we have on one hand the water from Fukushima going to the ocean. On the other hand, we have some sort of decision-making process if the nuclear tactical weapons are going to be used in Ukraine or not. And on the third hand, we have those people arguing who has more nuclear weapons, if Russia or the United States. But we should ask a simple question. How many of those bombs or those disasters do we need to destroy ourselves? And I think this is what should, prompt us to think about nuclear energy much deeper, not only as a security geopolitical implications, but also health and humanity implications. Maxime, thank you again for your time. I wish you good luck with your research and with your articles and activities that you're doing globally. Thank you again for joining us.